Sir, I share the YouTube link also, sir. I'll go and share, sir. Now I'll go and share the link. Now the meeting started. Now the link is generated. I forwarded to the mail ID. Sir, which one, sir?
நீங்க டேட் மாடிஃபை பண்ணீங்கன்னா ஈஸியா கிடைச்சிடும். நான் ஃபர்ஸ்ட் ஷார்ட்கட் இல்ல, பேஸ்ட் பண்ணு. நோ நோ நோ, டோன்ட் நெவர் டு தட். பேஸ்ட் ஷார்ட்கட் போட்டு இதுல தான் ப்ராப்ளம் ஷார்ட்கட் வரும். இதை இது பண்ணிருங்க. எனக்கு இந்த மவுஸ் ஒன்று கொடுத்துருக்கலாம்.
ஓகே சார்.
எனக்கு மவுஸ் கொடுத்தா
So I share the slide now only, sir.
Huh?
So I share the slide.
Like you have other slides to show, no? நம்ம யூடியூப் லிங்க் நம்ம ஃபர்ஸ்டே ரெடி பண்ணி வச்சுக்கலாம்.
இல்லை சார், அது வந்துட்டு இப்போ நம்ம யூடியூப் ப்ராட்காஸ்ட் பண்ணும்போது சார் லிங்க் ஜென்ரேட் ஆகும். நம்ம த்ரூ ஜூம் தான் ப்ராட்காஸ்ட் பண்ணுறோம் சார்.
ஓ, எல்லாரும் அனுப்புறாங்களா? பின்ன
அது வந்து நம்ம கிளிக் நவுன் கொடுத்துறாங்க சார் ஒரு வெப்சைட்ல. அந்த வெப்சைட்ல அந்த டைம்ல அது கரெக்டா அந்த
நம்ம பண்றது அது மாதிரி
நம்ம அது மாதிரி நம்ம வந்து வெப்சைட்ல கொடுத்துறோம் சார்.
பண்ணலாம் அப்படி.
நெக்ஸ்ட்
ஏன்னா நிறைய பேர் கேட்கறாங்க. இப்போ நான் எப்படி அனுப்புறது? நான் ஐம் கோயிங் டு டாக் இல்ல. ஓகே, எனக்கு மவுஸ் கொஞ்சம் அர்ஜென்ட்டா கொடுத்துருங்க. அப்புறமா இந்த இது மவுஸ் இங்க வைக்க இடம் இருக்குதா?
வைரஸ் மவுஸ் சார்.
இங்க வைக்க இடம் இல்ல. ஏன்னா சரி, இது எங்க ஸ்லைட்ஸ் பார்க்கலாம். டவுன்ல இருக்கா? ஓகே, நோ தட்ஸ் ஃபைன். ஸ்லைட்ஸ் வந்து டெஸ்ட் பண்ணிடலாம். நீ அதுக்குள்ள மவுஸ் எடுத்துட்டு வருங்க. ஏன்னா நான் வந்து அந்த நம்பர்ஸ்லாம் இருக்குல்ல, அதுக்கு சர்க்கிள் போடுவேன் நான்.
சரி, ஓகே.
Deepa, just check if the slides are all okay. Start clear?
Yes.
Yeah, you can request him. Deepak is not coming. Otherwise, no need of introduction. Just start off. Hi, Tony. I know. I saw him in the morning. Have you come here, Gerard, before? Have you come to this place before?
Second. Sir, also want yes, sir. இப்ப ஆஃப் ஆனது பாத்தீங்களா? Hello.
Yeah, result for you. That's result for people from Bangla who sleep without snoring. Good story. Including 15 minutes. And we plan. Maybe
A very good afternoon, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's session of the SJRI Development Club series. This is the seventh session of this very successful and fruitful academic series that was started in December 2021. The Journal Club series has become immensely successful in intensifying the collaborative and literary associations within the St. John's family. I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Tony, the Dean of SJRI, and Dr. Dennis Xavier, Professor of Pharmacology and Head Division of Clinical Research and Training. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to all the faculty members, students, and staff across the academy to this session. I would now like to invite Dr. Tony to say a few words before we start.
Thank you, Deepa. And again, on behalf of the Research Institute, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here, as well as those of you online, to this successful academic session, which was thought about and suggested by Dr. Dennis himself. And we're able to, really have this traction of collaboration between, the Research Institute and Medical College, the Nursing College, and the hospital faculty. So we're really happy that this is the seventh consecutive session. And we look forward to faculty across the academy to continue to participate in this. And the team chaired by Dennis and Dr. Madhumati and Dr. Deepa will continue to reach out to faculty across the academy. And this becomes a platform for you all to showcase your research work of the academy. And hopefully will foster more collaborations across. So having said that, it's also my pleasure to be the chairperson today for today's session, which is normally done by Dr. Dennis. And it's also my pleasure to introduce one of our star faculty to all of you. All of you probably know Dr. Dennis itself, but we had shared a very short bio of Dr. Dennis, that which itself is very impressive. But I do have his larger document, which is BioSketch, which runs into 4 or 5 pages, and it's very impressive. But just to give you an introduction, Dr. Dennis also is my classmate. And for those of you who don't know, he was an ace drummer in the old days, and we played in the college band, and we actually won the interclass culturals. So yes, we go back a long time, 35 years or more. But I've really seen him grow in the academy and achieve these wonderful achievements. He's been the head of pharmacology for 2 terms, I think, or more. And he was the vice dean for the postgraduate, for postgraduates at St. John's Medical College, and has been the head of the Division of Clinical Research. He continues as the head of the Division of Clinical Research in St. John's, where he's done a lot of his work that you'll hear today as has been part of this division and part of the Department of Pharmacology. He has been instrumental working with some brilliant mentors like Dr. Salim Yusuf and Dr. Prem Pais from St. John's to really move into cardiovascular disease and the epidemiology of these diseases over 2 decades. And as part of this journey, he's built several collaborations. Some of the studies he's done were enormous. He had to collaborate with over 210 centers across the country, in fact, outside the country as well. And managing such large trials where the N was like 10,000 or more is a challenge. And he and his team have been instrumental in doing such wonderful studies. To date, I think he and his team have recruited over 1,15,000 participants in over 48 large clinical research projects. Dr. Dennis is also serving on about 25 international research steering committees. He's been the principal investigator, and this is one of the star achievements as well, where St. John's was chosen as a center of excellence by the National Institute of Health. And he was leading that entire effort from St. John's. He also set up a course which is very popular in India, the Health Research Methodology course, running for almost 12 years now as part of the Research Institute's training activities in in research methodology. And recently they've started a course on RCTs. And I think this is a wonderful effort that he's in terms of training, not only faculty from St. John's, but across, it's an international course as well. So we receive students from India, participants from India and from outside. And they've trained over 2,100 such professionals, healthcare professionals from 7 countries of these 24 courses. He's been a member of different ethics committees, at least 4 such in the past and present. And one of his star achievements is he's been listed on the Stanford list of the, among the 2% of global scientists. All of you are familiar with the Stanford University list that came out. We're very proud that a few faculty from St. John's, Dr. Dennis, I think Dr. Prempas, Dr. Anura Kurpa, Dr. Harshad are all listed as the top 2%, which is a wonderful feather in our cap. Dr. Dennis is also a PhD and MD examiner. And today he sits on various review boards, but not only, these are international as well as national, the ICMR, the DBT. I know he's part of the Innovation BIRAC, review board, part of the UKMRC, and also for the Lancet, JACC, IHJ, and the IJMR. Dr. Dennis has, received several grants from the NIH, from CIHR Canada, NHMRC Australia, and the UKMRC, and the Wellcome Trust. And as he's published over 170 papers, many of them in reputed high-impact journals, NEJM, JAMA, BMJ, and the story that he'll tell you today, the articles that we circulated in the mail also are from one of these top journals. He has a very high H index, 64, which really reflects the kind of research effort. For those of you, the students here who want to know more about H index, go and Google it. You'll realize what it talks about when you talk about someone who's been an academic, someone who's been actively working in research. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Dennis, who's going to tell you a story about the poly pill. I know he conceived this story while he was doing his master's in epidemiology and at the McMaster University many years ago in 2007. But he's here going to tell you his journey on the poly pill and the evidence that they've created from those studies. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you very much, Dr. Tony, for that extremely generous introduction. Thank you all for coming this afternoon to share in this journey. Okay, give me a few seconds to get this mouse started. Okay. Okay, right.
What I'll be talking about today is a very, very quick introduction to our division, the Division of Clinical Research and Training at SJRI. And that's one of the objectives of our journal clubs, to get to know the different research groups here. I'll tell you a bit about the first study that we did, that is a CREATE registry, then speak briefly about the implementation research work that we have done, which were funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US. That is the SPREAD and the PREPARE study. The reason I'm speaking about this is because this is part of the strategy for us to reduce cardiovascular disease. So many of you sitting here will be wondering, is it really possible? And do you have the evidence to make a claim like that on your cover slide, on the title? So let's look at that. I'm grateful, and I will very briefly introduce the Hope Scholarship to you and speak about the series of polypill trials that we undertook. And finally, the meta-analysis of the fixed dose combinations on cardiovascular outcomes that we recently published. And finally, what are we doing with all this data? If it is just in the journals, it'll be sitting in a computer or somewhere else. But what else are we doing to make this reach people who matter the most? I'll start off with a very, very quick round of acknowledgement. There are so many people to acknowledge. I'll confine myself to acknowledge people here at St. John's. The very first person is Dr. Prem Pius, who is our senior colleague and my mentor. And to an extent, I may go ahead and say even a father figure. He was from the second batch of St. John's, the former dean, and also a key person, one of the three people who conceived of and helped the Research Institute to grow. The second person is Dr. Salim Yusuf, who was from the batch of 1975, the second Rhodes Scholar, and another mentor for me. Sometimes he's a tormentor. He gives me a hard time. Says, no. He's never happy with the work that I do. He says, no, you need to do better. You need to do better. I sometimes wonder, when will this man ever be happy with me? Anyway, but he's incredible. And he is listed, I think, number 6 or 7 in the Stanford list. Among Stanford list is made of the top clinical, top researchers in the world from all fields: medicine, astrophysics, to soil biology, to marine technology, to everything. So in terms of the impact of his work, is number 6 in the world and number 1 in Canada in all disciplines. So that's an incredible achievement, right? So I'm very, very grateful to him for all the opportunities and the challenges. As always, Frida is our senior staff over here. In a way, I'm the boss here at office, and she's the boss at home. Preeti is another senior colleague who works really, really hard. Susan and several ex-staff of DCRT, over 100 investigators this is over 500 investigators in India who participated in many of our studies. And what I meant by 100 people who worked on the polypill, that's what I meant. And more than 5,500 participants from India. India contributed more than half of the data globally to evaluate the polypill. And that's something very brave for us to be doing. So I wanted to mention that. There are over 10 funding agencies that helped the next few slides that would be coming. And of course, the St. John's management, they don't give it to you easily, but they give it to you when you really fight hard. Look at this facility here, and look at the beautiful campus we have and the enabling environment that we have for research. I'm sure your friends and colleagues who come from other places are very envious of the place that you work in. We have our problems, but we'll deal with that later. Okay, so collaborations in St. John's. There are some of you sitting here from community medicine. I'll not read out all the names. From general medicine, there are many people who've retired here. So Dr. Dominic is retired, Dr. Girija Singh retired from medicine, cardiology, Dr. Iyengar, Dr. Patil, all of them we worked with initially, endocrine department, psychiatry, Dr. Ashok, Dr. Uttara and I, we put together a very, very challenging grant. We didn't get that grant, but the two of them have done something really nice along with that. Suhas as well, from Research Society, Dr. Ramesh, from surgery, from neurology, from anesthesia, from ortho, from the Division of Data Management and Informatics, Dr. Tony, our Dean of the Research Institute, and several people from biostatistics. So it is 12 departments, 39 investigators that I've listed here, worked with them for 23 years. So for those of you not familiar, SJRI is consisted of, or is made up of 8 different divisions. And there are several other groups like the CAREAD group that Dr. Ashok leads, who's also part of our research environment or milieu in St. John's. And we are from the Division of Clinical Research and Training, and this is where it is. Okay, so this is the very first image that I want to show you of our 210 odd sites all across the country in over 80 cities. And we're really, really proud of our collaboration here in the east and the northeast. And we've done some really nice work with them. So this is a one-page summary of the different projects that we have done and published over the years. Most of them are investigator-initiated studies. A few of them are funded by pharma companies on new molecules or new drugs. That is also important. So in summary, 48 studies, over 100,000 participants, and our follow-up has been from as little as 1 month to as long as 7 years. And these are not easy studies to do, and I wanted to highlight this for you. So these are our key publications from over 250 odd papers, and most of them, as you see, are from the Lancet and the Lancet family. And I'll briefly touch upon this first observational study that we did. In a way, this is my first baby, so I'll always be very proud of it. So in the year 2000, there was very little data, very limited data on the kinds of patients who get acute coronary syndromes, in other words, heart attacks or variants of heart attacks, and what happens to them, how are they treated, and what are their outcomes. We don't know much about them. So we set this up. Firstly, we had 10 regional centers, and we had funding from different agencies. And we did this in collaboration with McMaster University, where Dr. Salim Yusuf played a key role, and Dr. Prem Pais and I led the study from here. So this is the distribution of our centers. We had 89 centers from 50 cities, and we had 10 regional coordinating centers. So in the year 2000, we identified 10 friends from different parts of the country, and we told them, we'd like to do the study. Would you invite approximately 10 other friends from your area and join us? So this is the power of networking and enhancing our collaboration. So this is what we did. And those days, there were multiple travels to all these places to go meet people, make friends, collaborate with them, help them solve problems, train them, etc., and come. So I'll just straight away run to our collaboration, because this is really, really important. So this paper was published in the Lancet, but firstly, let me tell you who these people are. So I told you this is Dr. Prem Pais, and this is my friend from Canada, a cardiologist. Dr. Prabhakaran and Dr. Srinath Reddy are from the Public Health Foundation of India now. At that time, they were in AIIMS Cardiology. Dr. Srinath Reddy is the president. Then we have Dr. Rajiv Gupta from Jaipur, from Nagpur, Prashant Joshi, Praful Kerkar from Mumbai, Dr. Tanika Chalam from Chennai, Dr. Haridas from Cochin, Jason from Ludhiana, from Hyderabad, from Kolkata, so on and so forth. The reason I'm telling you this is this was our first base. So we did this high quality study, and I will shortly tell you that this became quite popular, and this helped us build the collaboration. And if we are able to do clinical trials relatively easily later on and get large numbers, this is what makes it possible, and I wanted to highlight this for you. So this trial was, this observational study on how patients come to hospital with a heart attack, how they are treated, and what happens to them, how many people die, and why do they die. When we put all this together, we have some really interesting results. So very first, let me tell you, this is the editorial that accompanied this paper. So Kim Eagle from Michigan called this a major milestone, since it provides the first comprehensive view of the epidemic of acute coronary syndrome in India. Next, they go on to say, a problem well defined is half solved. So we know who are the people getting heart attacks, what is happening to the treatments, what are the limitations in the treatments, and therefore what do we need to do. So then here, the next obvious step is to define and implement improved measures for primary and secondary prevention. So this really, really encouraged us and said, okay, we need to go ahead and do more studies that identify optimal treatments. So this was all over the media, from the BBC, where's the BBC, right top corner. This is the BBC here, to the Wall Street Journal wrote about it, the China Post wrote about it, and all over the place, people were really, really excited. What was exciting about this? So we had close to 21,000 patients recruited. It is the biggest study from any low and middle income country that was done at that time. And eventually we worked with about 20,500 patients. And these are our data of the 20,500 odd patients. I'll just stop sharing, or stop the laser pointer. Stop the pen and use a laser pointer perhaps. Okay, so So mean age of our participants was about 56, which is about 10 years lesser than what we find in Western countries. So that's bad news. Young people are getting heart attacks and coming to hospital, right? After they reach the hospital, it takes them 50 minutes, 50 minutes to get thrombolysis. That means to lyse that clot in whatever way. The guidelines at that time, even in year 2000, was 30 minutes. That means we are on average double the time that it takes. So you can imagine. So at that time, only 5% used an ambulance to get to hospital. And the health minister spoke about this 2 days later in the Hindu newspaper and said, we need to do something about our ambulance services. Of course, I don't think this study should take the credit for how good our ambulance systems have improved since then to now. There were a portion of people who came by bullock cart as well to hospital with a myocardial infarction, and because we had an option other, ambulance, public transport, whatever, and other, they did write bullock cart. Anyways, so and another tragic thing was 3/4 of patients paid their entire hospital bill out of their pocket. Now we are aware that insurance has greatly improved. So this is, in the year 2000 onwards, how this was. So this risk factors, clinical features, etc., which I would skip. This is treatments in hospital. These are outcomes at 1 month, which I will skip as well. But I'll come to this slide, which is one of the key findings of our study, that is treatments by socio-economic status. So we categorize people into rich, upper middle class, lower middle class, and poor. It was, now those of you in public health and community medicine, don't ask me too many questions about how exactly you classified it, but we were required to validate this. But we'll keep the message simple over here and see that all treatments except antiplatelet drugs were highly statistically significantly different in the poor compared to the richer groups. Let's take a few examples. Let's take thrombolysis, 61% in the rich and 52% in the poor. Large numbers, so it's highly statistically significant. Let's take another example of lipid-lowering drugs. Now, patients who've come to a hospital with a myocardial infarction need lipid-lowering drugs. This is treatments in hospital. 61% in the rich and almost half of that in the poor. Let's take an angiogram. 41% in the rich. Why should it be 1/5 of that in the poor? Is it that they don't have coronaries? The coronaries are not eligible. We know what they don't have. Let's take an angioplasty, 15% here and 1/7 of that in the poor. CABG, 7.5%. This is within 1 month, and 1/10 of that here. So friends, as you can see, there are highly statistically significant differences in the way in which the rich were treated compared to the poor. Let's look at just mortality by socioeconomic status. This is crude death rates. So at 1 month, 5.5% of the rich died compared to 8.2 in the poor. When I saw this data for the first time, I said, oh, okay, a little higher in the poor compared to the rich. So this was 20 years ago when I saw this data. And one of the first things we tell our students here when you're looking at data is quickly calculate and see in your mind itself. You don't need a calculator. You don't even need the back of an envelope to calculate. So let's take this, keep this simple for young people out here. When you look at data, this is a mistake I made. I didn't take this very seriously. So if we take poor as 8% and rich as 5%, a difference of 3, very simple. 3 out of 5 is 60%. Oh, now it hits you. Mortality in the poor is 60% more than the rich. Oh my God, why is that? Why is that? Right? Then we said, oh, risk factors are different. I didn't show you those data on risk factors. Risk factors are different, so maybe because of that. So what we did is statistically, we adjusted for the risk factors. In other words, using statistical techniques, we removed the effect of the variations in risk factors. So this is what we found. So this is the death rates now, the top line, death rates adjusted for risk factor. That means if you remove, so in other words, if the poor and the rich had the same rates of risk factors, this would be the revised rates of death. 5.1, 5.9, 6.7, 7.8. This is still highly statistically significant, as you can see here. The next number that we have here are what is called odds ratios. Okay, odds ratios, which is derived from this analysis that we make. So what we do, and this is for people not so familiar, I'll very briefly explain this to you. So we fix this number for the rich as 1, compared to 1, 5.9, right? Compared to 5.1, 5.9 is 16% more than 1, 32% more than rich, and 57% more than the rich. So the poor, mortality in the poor is still 60% more than that in the rich. right? And this is this is the 95% confidence interval, and this is still statistically significant. What else is different in the rich versus the poor? What we saw in a table, I don't know why this goes on and off. Is it, I'm not shaking anything here, but anyway, let's continue on. So we said the other major difference we found is in the treatments that people got. Remember, lipid lowering drugs, angioplasty, and all of that. Suppose the rich and the poor got similar treatments at 1 month, what would happen? So let's just look at the odds ratios here. 1, 1, 1, 1, and your p-value is 1. What does this mean? In simple English, all this means is if the poor got the same treatment as the rich, we can save what proportion of poor people dying? 60% at 1 month, not later on. In another study that we did, when we followed up data for 2 years, it was further. So the difference between the rich and poor became much, much more. So what were the treatment related factors that we looked at? Look at the very last line here. The type of hospital, the time it took them to go to hospital, the drugs they got in hospital, and the interventions they got in hospital. So if the poor got the same treatments of the rich, 50% of their lives would be saved. And we also have data that the poor are 10 years younger than the rich in this cohort or in this group. So this is what went, or in these days, we can say this is what went viral in those days. Okay, so let me briefly talk to you about the Center of Excellence. Let me also keep track of time. Okay, thank you. So the NIH recognized us as a Center of Excellence. This was something which Dr. Tony remarked as well. So our grant was cardiovascular disease prevention and capacity building in developing countries. So we were one of 11 centers globally, and we got a grant of $4.5 million at that time, which was quite substantial for us to undertake 3 knowledge translation studies. We had 185 researchers in this program and several other support staff who worked with us. And we also conducted 6 training programs, and 200 people were trained, and many of them were trained over 2 years in a research mentorship program. A model of that program is still continuing to this day. And Dr. Tony, you need to add 1 more year to your estimate of 12. So we completed the 13th year this February, and we plan to continue on with our training. So these are the centers all across the world, from Bangladesh, India, Kenya, South Africa, Peru, etc. So this is one study that we did as part of this project. It is community health worker-based intervention to improve adherence to drugs and lifestyle after acute coronary syndrome. Now you saw the really bad data in hospital, rich and poor, such big differences. What happens to them when they go back home? It gets further worse. It gets further worse. So we wanted to make sure these people are contacted, they are kept in touch with, and then they can't go back to the cardiologist for every little thing. So what can we do? Can community health workers, who are doing a fantastic job in the community, can we get them similar model in a hospital setting? So the WHO was beginning to write about it at that time, task sharing, task shifting, they were talking about, and then we began to adopt that. And we did this as a hospital-based study. It was a randomized controlled trial. We did this in 14 hospitals. And what we tried to do is in those patients who are discharged after a heart attack, what is the impact of community health worker-based interventions at 1 year on adherence to evidence-based medication, as well as lifestyle modification? So this is a 1-year follow-up study. So a community health worker was a 10th or 12th grade passed individual only, who knows the local language and knows a little bit of English. That's all we wanted. We trained them here in St. John's. We had manuals, we had central training here, and on site for 3 months. They were trained at their hospital for 3 months. We also had a project officer who oversaw the program. So we developed this calendar it is called Vita, which is called a visual tool for adherence. And they could, it's a calendar for 1 year. It has 12 sheets and with slots for 6 evidence-based medication details that they can write here, and they can tick it off. And they hang it in their house. That itself reminds them that they have to keep buying their medications and taking it regularly. And we also had a spread patient diary. All of this was developed locally, translated in about 6 or 8 languages, and customized for each patient and verified at each visit. So this is the training that is going on. And those of you from St. John's will recognize Dr. Soumya over here from General Medicine. She played an active role over here. So these are people being trained. Here is the blood pressure machine. So these are people with a 10th or 12th grade education, and they're able to do this. And they're very enthusiastic about doing it. That's the best part. So 806 patients were randomized, and we had 98% follow-up at the end of 1 year. And we had highly statistically significant improvement in medication adherence at the end of 1 year. And of course, there were improvements in systolic blood pressure, diastolic, no improvement. There were improvement in BMI, etc. Tobacco, huge improvements in tobacco use, in alcohol use, the difference, physical activity, as well as diet. And all these were very simple mechanisms or methods by which we trained them as well as assessed them. Our colleagues from community medicine, and I can see only Dr. Gaud over here. So we had Dr. Twinkle, Dr. Farah, and Dr. Dominic, as well as Dr. Shailendra Hegde, who worked with us in rural areas to do something similar in a primary prevention population. The previous population was, right? The previous population, those who had a heart attack and were going back home. But people here in rural areas, we had 26 clusters of rural areas that we identified. And these were people who have a risk for cardiovascular disease, but still don't have manifest heart attack or strokes. So this was an even more difficult project to undertake. And this was published in the American Heart Journal. And my good friend, Dr. Rajneesh Joshi, led this. And there were a team of us who were part of this as well. So our colleagues from community medicine developed all these simple, tools or reminders to give people like a tobacco show card or a poster or a salt container or a pill pouch or a mobile phone pouch, all of which had messages for them to take care of their heart health. Right? And so 2,538 households and 3,300 individuals were randomized in 3 rural clusters and totally 26 villages, if I recall. And there was a 90% follow-up, 93% follow-up here in these areas. And here as well, adherence modestly improved. The primary outcome was systolic blood pressure, and there's only a small improvement in systolic blood pressure at the end of 1 year. So with this, let me move on with this background of studies that we did to evaluating interventions that can have a huge difference. 50% difference is huge, right? Huge difference in cardiovascular outcomes. So this is the polypill hypothesis. Right? This is the editorial that Dr. Salim Yusuf wrote in the Lancet in 2002. He wrote this along with the heart protection study. Those of you in medicine or cardiology will remember this landmark study, which was done on simvastatin in the late 1990s and published in 2000. It came out in 2001, 2002. And this is what the title of that editorial was: 2 decades of progress in the prevention of cardiovascular disease. And he said, if we use a combination of drugs, remember this is 20 years ago, he said, if you use a combination of drugs in secondary prevention, there'll be incremental benefit of each drug over the other. It'll have a multiplicative effect. And he estimated a 75% reduction in events at the end of 1 year. A year later, this is the cover page of the BMJ, right? And so this looks like a UFO that has landed, a huge UFO that has landed. And people are pretty curious. One person is touching it here. One person is looking in awe over here. My God, what is this? What is going on? Some people have come with a family. There's a dog as well here. So they've come to see what is this polypill about. Because this article, which the editor of the BMJ said, and he's a good friend of ours, Dr. Richard Smith. He has come here. He's conducted training programs here as well. The editor here in his editorial, he wrote, preserve this copy. You'll need this for the next 50 years, is what he wrote, among other things. So what was this about? This was by Nicholas Wald and Malcolm Law, both epidemiologists and a cardiologist, who said, here is a strategy to reduce cardiovascular disease by more than 80%. This is a very serious claim. Okay, so what did they do? What they did, they said, if we have 4 categories of drugs, right? If you have 4 categories of drugs, and if we give it to everybody above the age of 55 without even measuring cardiovascular risk, and anyone who's got cardiovascular disease, at the end of 1 year, you can reduce cardiovascular mortality by more than 80%. How did they do this? They did statistical or mathematical modeling from previous available data. It's a very elegant study that was done. There are very complex tables in this. I will spare you all that, and I will just tell you what the conclusion is. The polypill strategy, and I'll shortly tell you what the polypill is. The polypill strategy could largely prevent heart attacks and strokes if taken by everyone above the age of 55. In a few years, I'll get there.
and everyone with existing cardiovascular disease, it would be acceptably safe and with widespread use have a great impact of preventing disease in the Western world, right? So that's what they said. Okay, now the world was immediately divided into two. One half said, what a fantastic idea. Let's learn more about it. The other half said, what a stupid idea. You want to take everybody from this place above the age of 55 and medicate them with not 1, 2, 3, but 5 different drugs. Right? So can you imagine the dichotomy over there, friends? Half the world thought, fantastic idea, let's go explore more. We need more data. I'm not going to accept it as such. The other half said, stupid idea, trash this idea. But some of us said, let's go and explore this idea. And at that time, I was happy or fortunate, I would say, to get the Hope Scholarship between 2005 and 2007. Just a couple of years after that, I went to McMaster University. For those of you not familiar, McMaster University is the place where clinical epidemiology was formulated, the words by late Dr. Dave Sackett, and the principles and the terminology, evidence-based medicine came from there, Dr. Gordon Guyatt. And then both of these gentlemen have taught in our courses, and also problem-based learning came from there. So when I went to do my course there weren't too many lectures like this. Small groups, sit down, you're given papers, you're given problems, you need to discuss and solve it. And you need to read a lot before you're able to do that. Right. So I did a master's in clinical epi and biostatistics. I also worked at the institute called Population Health and Research Institute, and I did the TIPS trial there. That was my master's thesis, which I will briefly tell you about. We also undertook 2 other major studies called Interstroke and HOPE-3. I will be talking about HOPE-3 towards the end of this discussion. So this is McMaster University, which is about 120 years old, and this new modern building is about 20 years old. It was just getting finished in 2004. Right. So TIPS stands for the Indian Polycap Study. And in 2005, what we asked is, firstly, can we formulate a polypill with 5 or 6 drugs? If you put 5 or 6 drugs, it will become a horse pill. Humans can't consume it. Can we do that? Indian companies are very good with formulation, and we managed to do that. How will it be given when we give to individuals at low or average risk? Will people tolerate it? So I'll tell you shortly. It has 3 blood pressure lowering drugs, a statin and an aspirin and a thiazide. Oh no, thiazide is part of the blood pressure lowering drug. What will happen to people when we give something like this? And all of us also are trained in pharmacology about irrational combinations, correct? So that is something that we shouldn't be using. So, but we said, is this a rational combination? Can we formulate it, give it to people and see how it acts? So this study was published in the Lancet, and we did this study on 2,053 individuals, all in India. So TI, the I over here stands for Indian, and we're very proud of that, the TIPS study, right? So these are drugs. Aspirin 100 milligrams, simvastatin 20 milligrams, ramipril 5 milligrams, atenolol 50, and hydrochlorothiazide 12.5. So the last 3 are blood pressure lowering drugs. This is a lipid lowering drug, and this is an antiplatelet. And other than antiplatelet drug, all these other drugs are at half doses. So we give this and see how it would work. So our objectives were to see this whole polypill compared to its components. So that is what is written here. I'll not go through these objectives in detail, but we wanted to find out if this polypill would actually work. And because we have put 5 drugs together, will it act synergistically, or will one drug block the effect of the other drug, to put it in colloquial terms? So these were the 8 combinations that we had. We had 4 combinations of 2 drugs, 4 drugs, single drug and single drug. And these were all in clinical trials. We have this, what is called a non-inferiority comparison, which is to say this drug is no worse there, or in simpler terms is similar to this drug. That's called a non-inferiority comparison. The next comparison we had is a superiority comparison, wherein the polypill, for example, contains 3 blood pressure lowering drugs. Will that be superior to another combination which has only 2 blood pressure lowering drugs? I hope this is making sense. So we had 4 non-inferiority comparisons and 4 superiority comparisons. So the design of this trial, I can say this in my sleep because it is in my thesis, right, is a partial factorial combination of non-inferiority and superiority comparisons along with a reciprocal design, reciprocal combination. So that's what the whole design is. Dr. Salim Yusuf, who's worked on over 100 trials, he said this is the most complex trial that he has designed. So I recall those days where I'd go to his office, and in 15 minutes we will come up with one design, and then we'll go, and I'll go back to my room and then try to write up the rest of the protocol. It was incredible learning experience with him, and that man is so very sharp and intelligent and so quick in his thinking. Right, so 53 centers in India. We from St. John's were the coordinating office, and then we also had an international coordinating center, which helped, and we had a central lab as well. So who were our participants? People above the age of 45 who had at least one cardiovascular risk factor, different from the BMJ paper where they said, don't measure any risk factors. We said, no, we want people who have at least one risk factor, either hypertension or diabetes, or has been a smoker for more than 5 years, etc. Right. And then finally, we had 2,053 participants. Polypill arm, we had 400 odd, and all the other 8 arms, we had roughly 200. So it's a 2:1, kind of a comparison that we did. And this is the flow chart over here, which I'll not go through, but let me tell you who these people are. So, 54 years, and we had 34% who had diabetes, and about 13% who were smokers, and less than 50% were women. Systolic blood pressure, just a little bit high, 134 overall. This is mean, and diastolic 85. These are our lipid levels. These are our results. Combinations that had one blood pressure lowering drug, we just focus on systolic here, reduced systolic blood pressure by 2.2 millimeters of mercury. 2 blood pressure lowering drugs reduced it by 4.7, 3 blood pressure 6.9, and Polycap 7.4. So those of you who'd like to look a little more into the analysis, a Polycap has 3 blood pressure lowering drugs. We looked at whether the Polycap is not inferior to the combinations having 3 blood pressure lowering drugs. Make sense? And whether the Polycap is superior to the 2 blood pressure lowering, and also superior to the single blood pressure lowering combinations that we had, right? So this is the impact on LDL. This is in millimoles. So simvastatin alone reduced by 0.83 millimoles, and Polycap reduced it by 0.7. Interestingly, when we add aspirin in the combination, it reduces the effect of simvastatin, which we found clinically here. We also found that in a bioavailability study that we also did separately. So there is some interaction over there, which we found out. Anyway, let's move on. So if we model this, so if we say LDL-C with simvastatin 20 milligrams reduces it by 0.8, from literature, we can extrapolate and say it reduces CHD, coronary heart disease, by 27% and strokes by 8%. Diastolic blood pressure reducing by 5.7 gives you these kind of reductions. So if we compute all of this, this is not a mere addition, friends. Okay, this is a proportional increase. So 27%. So from the baseline risk, we reduce it to 27%. Of what is left, we reduce that by another 24%. Of what is left, we reduce that by another 32%. So it's an overall 62% reduction in risk of coronary heart disease and 48% by stroke. We are quite a bit far away from the 80% rates that were told in the BMJ. So we are around the 60% range. Okay, so let's move on. So these were a conclusion. So the Polycap is similar to the added effects of each of its 3 blood pressure lowering components. There is incremental lowering with each added blood pressure lowering drug. You saw that very clearly in the table. There are no significant drug-drug interaction except for the simvastatin aspirin, right? And it is fairly well tolerated. I've not shown you the ADR profile. And so therefore, our final conclusion was that Polycap could potentially reduce cardiovascular disease by about half. Okay, so this is based on what? Risk factor reduction. We have not counted events. We've done this only for 12 weeks. Next step. Remember, we used only half doses of the drugs for lipid lowering as well as for blood pressure lowering. Can we double the dose in the same population? We did that, and we published this in the circulation, and I'll spare you the data, but for now, we call it, so it was 2 doses, 2 capsules of the same Polycap versus 1 capsule. That was a randomization in 518 patients or participants that we got. And we found that the double dose further reduced blood pressure, further reduced lipids without increasing adverse effects. We were delighted. So this is more like a dose finding study now. We said, okay, we're going to use this dose safely in people. So what are the messages we've got here so far? 1, we can formulate a polypill. Even half doses of blood pressure lowering drugs up to 3 significantly reduces blood pressure. This is an incremental benefit, right? And there's not much of an interaction. So we can go ahead, and this is another invited paper that a group of us wrote in Nature Cardiovascular Disease. But let's go to the last section of our discussion today. This is this title was actually given by the Cardiology Society of India when they invited me to give this talk, The Final Frontier in Primary Prevention, and that is the impact of a polypill in clinical events. Blood pressure lowering is fine, lipid lowering is fine, right? What about saving lives? What about reducing MI? What about reducing strokes? Those were the questions asked. So now this is the international polycap study. So we moved on from India to international now, and these were our objectives. This is to determine in those without cardiovascular disease whether polypill reduces the composite of cardiovascular events, and I'll list out the cardiovascular events, and whether polypill plus aspirin, the first polypill, excuse me. So there are two versions of the polypill here, one with aspirin and one without aspirin, because there are some people who can't tolerate aspirin, particularly over a long period of time. But this is a clinical event study. We're going to give these drugs for 5 years to people. So we don't want them stopping drugs at 1 month, 3 months, etc. So we screened them, and those who could not tolerate aspirin, we did not include them in the study. So there were two versions of the polypill, which I will show you now. The composite events are cardiovascular death, non-fatal stroke, or non-fatal MI, or heart attack, stroke, and death due to any cardiovascular disease. These were a composite outcome. That means we put them all together and count them at the end of 5 years. So this is our factorial randomized control trial. Factorial means there is more than one treatment in the same trial. So polypill versus placebo, we allocate them. And this is the polypill here now. Atenolol 100 milligram, not 50. Ramipril, not 5, 10 milligrams. Hydrochlorothiazide, not 12.5, but 25 milligrams. And simvastatin, 40 milligrams. So everybody got this high dose or the double dose or the full dose. Sorry, not high dose, we call it the full dose. So further, people who did not have a contraindication to aspirin were randomized further to aspirin or placebo, and aspirin we continued at 75 milligrams daily. Who are our people? People who are our participants, we included, who had a cardiovascular risk of more than 1% per year. That means if you take 100 such patients at the end of 1 year, at least one of them will have any one of those events. So who are these people? They have a certain risk criteria, and that's what we took. So men over the age of 50 and women over the age of 55 with the inter-heart risk score of more than 10. It's a particular way in which to calculate based on some of the studies we were involved in. And we did not include those who already had cardiovascular disease, who already had angina, who already had a history of stroke or an MI, etc. Okay, I should be done in another 8 to 10 minutes, Dr. Tony. Okay, so this is India's contribution. So half of our patients came from India, and these were the other countries where we recruited patients from. And our patients were about 64 years old. About half of them were women, and about 84% had hypertension, and about 37% had diabetes or increased glucose, and about 10% were smokers. This is polypill versus placebo at the end of 5.5 to 6 years. So the hazard ratio is 0.79. That means there was a 21% reduction in cardiovascular death, MI, stroke, and we also included heart failure, cardiac arrest, or revascularization, which are more or less equal to either having an MI or a stroke. So we put them all together. It's a 21%, just about statistically significant result in our primary outcome. So it's not just reduction in blood pressure and lipids things, but this actually saved lives. 21% is a fairly good and statistically significant, right? And what about adverse events? We always worry over 5 years, what about adverse events? So you will see 0.8% in the polypill group and actually 1.2% in the placebo group. These are the serious adverse events, and similar rates, or dizziness or hypertension a little higher in the polypill. Remember, these people are taking full doses of 3 blood pressure lowering drugs, right, compared to 1.1 here. Muscle pain or weakness, we always worry about giving statins. 0.5 here and 0.5 here, not much of a problem. What happens when we add aspirin? We combine aspirin with the polypill, right? So these are the 4 groups that we have. So we'll just focus on the double placebo. That means people who got only placebo, and 2 groups, 1 group who got aspirin. So 2 groups, 1 group. 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 And the one at the bottom is green over here. These are the people who got polypill plus aspirin, and the hazard ratio here is 0.69. In other words, there was a 31% statistically significant reduction in any of these outcome events at 5.5 to 6 years. Right, so polypill plus aspirin has an additional or an incremental reduction. So this was published in the NEJM, and there are 4 of us from St. John's in this paper. There is Dr. Prem Pius, here is Frida, and this is Girish, Preeti Girish, and myself. So this was quite an impactful paper. To summarize, in intermediate risk population, with an average of 4.6 years of follow-up, there's a 21% reduction in CVD with the polypill alone, and a 31% reduction if we add aspirin to that group. Our non-adherence was about 25%, people not taking medications. If we do a sensitivity analysis for that, that means if you model them as if they took the medication, it's not 31, it comes to 40% reduction if people took their medication. That means even in a trial setting, about a quarter of the patients over 5 years are not taking their medications. This is not for contraindication. They just stop taking medication. Why should I keep swallowing a capsule when I'm otherwise fine, right? So implications, 30 to 40% cardiovascular risk reduction with the polypill and aspirin. Of course, it is half of the originally hypothesized benefits. But friends, this is real data on real patients, and we have counted events here. But this is still important, a 40% reduction with a polypill, right? If half of the eligible people in the world use a polypill along with aspirin, up to 5 million, 50 lakh cardiovascular events could be avoided each year globally. That's the impact of this intervention as such. The future polypills, now you will say, atenolol, oh, forget it. What are you talking about? Simvastatin, we have better drugs. Simvastatin is not even stocked in our, remember, this was 20 years ago, 17 years ago, right? We have better drugs now. So rosuvastatin, atorvastatin will have even better impact. Bisoprolol, even better impacts we could have, right? So it could lead to even larger benefits. And even with the same formulation, we can have up to 50% reduction. So these were the 8 organizations that supported the polypill trial with the Wellcome Trust. They initially gave us £5 million, and then they added, I think close to £12 million is what was given, and several other organizations funded this. I'll conclude with this very last study, very briefly, the meta-analysis of polypill studies. TIPS-3 is one of 3 polypill studies that fit into a particular criteria. And this paper was published in the Lancet just about 8 months ago. And Dr. Phil Joseph from Canada led the study, and Dr. Prem Pius and myself are part of this group. So what we wanted to do is put together all studies which were randomized controlled trials, which had more than 1,000 participants and who had more than 2 years of follow-up, which tested a fixed dose combination strategy and look at their impact on cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, stroke, or revascularization. So put all these studies together, and that's what we do in a meta-analysis of similar studies. We put them together. And TIPS-3 you're familiar with. So we had 5,700 odd people, and this is a polypill that we used along with aspirin. HOPE-3 was another study that we were involved in as well. About 20 countries were involved in, and HOPE-3 had 12,000 participants. But of the 12,000 participants, people who took candesartan, hydrochlorothiazide, and rosuvastatin compared to those who took only placebo were 6,300. So all drugs compared with placebo. And there was a nice trial done by some colleagues from Iran. And this was a 6,800 participant trial. This was their polypill, hydrochlorothiazide, enalapril or valsartan, along with atorvastatin and aspirin. And about 6,000 participants were included in this trial. So if we put all of them together, what kind of a result will we get? This is our result, right? So 18,000 participants totally. Right, and this is TIPS-3, HOPE-3, and PolyIran, and more or less similar, profile, except that we had more hypertension in the TIPS-3 study. We also had more diabetes in our study, 40% almost in TIPS-3. So here are our results. Fixed dose combination versus control. We had a hazard ratio of 0.62, or in other words, 38% reduction, highly statistically significant. A similar hazard ratio, how come the p-value is that much lower and the upper bound of the confidence interval is so much away from the point of unity, is because we have larger numbers here. So this is the power of putting together more numbers, and we have more events. So there were 721 primary outcome events, which is huge. So that's how we get such a clear effect. Remember, this is FDC versus control. right? Yeah, I'll skip this and I'll add FDC along with aspirin. What do we get? Primary outcome hazard ratio of 0.53. And look at the upper bound of the confidence, 95% confidence interval of 0.67. It is so much far away from 1. So this result is very, very clear. There's no doubt about this. Okay, so it is a 47% reduction of the composite and a 49% reduction in cardiovascular death alone. I'll stop there and I'll give you the conclusions. Despite modest, and the difference in blood pressure were not that much, right? FDC substantially reduced fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events, a 38% reduction in cardiovascular death. And those of you who would like an NNT, it is just 52. Number needed to treat is just 52, a 48% reduction in MI, 42% in stroke, and 35% in cardiovascular death with FDC alone. If you add the FDC along with aspirin, 47% reduction, and an NNT further drops to 37. That means if 37 people were treated with this drug over this period, you can prevent one of these events, and these are the outcomes here. So I will move on and tell you the very last thing, which is the next step. For wider impact, we need to go beyond research. We need to address public health issues. We need to engage with governments and world bodies, and that's exactly what we are doing. And if we do that, there's a potential for a global impact in cardiovascular disease prevention. So a few weeks back, several of us were in Geneva for the World Heart Federation Fixed Dose Combination Forum. It was a 2-day meeting, 1 and 3/4 days to be precise. Researchers, clinicians, and policymakers from over 20 countries got together. Representatives from the World Heart Organization as well as the World Heart Federation were there. There were short lectures, 8 minutes, 12 minutes lectures, but long panel discussions and recommendations at the end of each session, brilliantly conducted. So we should have shorter input sessions and more discussions. So from India, I went from St. John's, and we had another colleague coming in from the Public Health Foundation of India. So 2 of us went from India. And one of the things we are doing with the WHO is to lobby with them to include the polyp pill in the essential medicines list, right? So we applied in 2013, very little data at the time, they rejected. 2015, rejected. 2017, rejected. Right? And these are the comments they gave. I just gave you the title of their documents that they give, right? And then, and this is our strategy for the 2022 and 23 application, which is going to go in the next month or so. I think it's October, right? So 3 different strategies that we are utilizing. We have robust data now. We didn't have these data in 2013 and 15 and 17. We have this data. We are fairly confident that the WHO will consider this in the essential medicines list. And that will have huge impacts because governments will be responsible for stocking these essential medicines wherever they're supposed to stock them. So friends, let me conclude. In 2003, it was a hypothesis based on modeling which Walden Law did, that BMJ paper that I showed you, which says there can be an 80% mortality reduction. 19 years later, now there is robust evidence of 50% mortality reduction over 4 to 5 years, and with added interventions, that is using a non-physician health worker, mobile reminders, reducing costs, increasing access to drugs, we can have improved adherence. Remember, this 50% reduction is a 25% low or people who don't take the medication, and we can have much higher reductions. Happy to tell you and to conclude that India, and particularly St. John's, played a major role in this globally impactful strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dennis, for that very engaging and enlightening talk, to sharing your journey from the CREATE study across the other NIH-funded studies, the SPREAD and the PREPARE, and then to finally culminate with the evidence that you all have created on the polyp pill, on the polycap, including sharing the meta-analysis and the efforts to move policy. I now open this out to questions to the audience. And if those of you would like to ask a question, we have about 10 minutes for questions, and there's tea and coffee served outside. So I'd like you to, there's a mic there. You can turn on the mic, just now, just put up your hands, and then you can ask your question, but just introduce yourself. Just share your name and your department or your class. Yeah, yeah. You can even make comments. You don't have to ask a question, but you can share your thoughts. So it's open to you all now. Anyone?
So, Mayor Dr. Tony.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Tony, Dr. Dennis. Thanks a lot for sharing all of your work with us. Myself, Dr. B. Ramakrishna Gaur, I come from the Department of Computer. Thanks for acknowledging our department and its work with you. And good afternoon, dear friends here. So, Dr. Dennis, I was just wondering, I do see Dr. Ashok in the audience. From a mental health perspective, assuming that Polypen works the way you have found it, working in the subjects, is there a scope for adding one more molecule into it, given the current evidence of how mental health is impacting these chronic diseases and mental health issues themselves being considered as chronic diseases? Is there a scope, given the risk factor, given the kind of impact they tend to have directly and indirectly on the diseases that you mentioned, and also the role in adherence and other issues?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Gaud. So I'll answer half or I'll answer part of your question, and I'll toss the other one to our good friends here, Dr. Ashok and Dr. Suhas, who are involved with community mental health initiatives. So a patient who walks into our OPD or somebody who we go and see in the community as we do doesn't come with one issue really. Above the age of 40, 45, 50, they have, most of them have more than one chronic condition, right? And the thrust now is to look at multimorbidity. So that's another new initiative or a new thrust itself of different governments to look at that and to provide comprehensive services. Right. In fact, the NIH came up with a call recently. It was just before the pandemic, so it's about 3 or 4 years back, wherein they said we want you to address cardiovascular disease and mental health together. Right. So one impacts the other, and it kind of goes both ways. So I don't know about adding a psychiatry drug in a polypill at the moment. Maybe we should do a trial together. But I'll ask Dr. Ashok to comment on that.
Thank you so much. To audacious studies, there are layers of research, plus evidence from across the population across the world. Physics, smart strategies, on public agencies, where the literature remarkable work on your side, and so much to learn by any one of us. Any kind of resources. In fact, the question of me. So, yeah, I mean, there is so much of literature growing up on this, especially on the kind of depression as a kind of claim, sometimes just quantitative measures. Look at how it influences outcomes in diet. And there's a lot of interesting evidence, I think, partly some of which I think also Srinivasan and Mario heart rate and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think it seemed like a good thing to think about, especially India, where you're experiencing a lot of younger age people. Jayadeva has got, I think something recently.
They have a registry, yeah.
Most people increase people around 30 years of age coming over the last 5 years. Such a huge increase. So whether mental health does play a role in just because a lot of the studies, I mean, I'm not taking away from their studies, but when you have this large cohort of heart diseases, I mean, there are people who are often 50 and 50 plus age groups. So in that age group, I'm looking at depression and maybe even minor psychiatric, including anxiety. That seems to be something which St. John's can probably work upon. It seems that we are to kind of maybe to organize these kind of studies. Seems like something to think about, because clinically we believe that it probably has a big impact. Apart from whatever we might have done in small small scale follow-up studies. We believe that it probably is it also probably there's also the issue of diabetes being very high in the cohorts that you just mentioned in the study. And the depression and diabetes having such a big thing. So it will be probably something that can further look into. And adding antidepressants into the follicle is there are many interactions, drug interactions, and the safer antidepressants coming in play, they often get to bump up levels. So I don't know if we can save some cost by reducing the doses of other drugs and bump up the levels. But certainly it did occur to me that in the younger population, taking mental health as one of the things that some experience
Thank you for that, Dr. Ashok. Any other comments? Go ahead, Dr. Anand.
Good afternoon. Goes without saying that probably your team and you have been the middle of trial and anything more complex trial designs that this will exist. I have two questions. One is very basic question. Is of interpreting the results of using a relative risk versus an absolute risk reduction. Because sometimes in these large trials, I mean, there may be a thing of over inflating out the relative risk looking larger than what it is. Like in TIPS 3, the absolute difference is 1.5%, but a relative risk reduction is 50%. But similarly, the adverse effects actually it was double in polygon. And if you take a relative risk there, it will be probably 100% as compared to a placebo. So how do you balance and how do you interpret this in real time in a real clinic scenario? I mean, when you say that 1%, 2%, 3%, what is the significance? Or is it just a statistical significance that we are considering? And I'm talking about the absolute risk.
Okay, this can be a long debate, which maybe we should not get into now, and it kind of gets technical. So all that I would say is, let's look at the bigger picture over here. Whether you're looking at relative risks or absolute risks, is there a difference that we are finding? And is that difference clinically important? And who decides clinical importance? Is clinicians, it's people, and it's the governments eventually. Right, and it's eventually the governments. And for ease of understanding, as you know well, we compute the number needed to treat and the number needed to harm, right? And that's easier for clinicians to interpret. So whichever way you want to look at it, you have both the data here. So I wouldn't miss the forest for the trees over here and get into these kind of debates. Maybe the neighbor sitting, or your neighbor can maybe add a little more. Dr. Tiku is the head of statistics. So Dr. Tiku, would you want to answer a part of that question? The statistical part, I will stop with the earlier part.
It's a very relevant question, and the trick is in interpreting relative risk versus absolute risk difference. So it really depends on what is the level of risk to start with that you're comparing. So a risk difference of 1%, if you're talking about risk, absolute risk of 3%, I mean, that is a big difference as opposed to much higher risk. So again, I would put it back to the clinician to make that decision, because it is all about clinical significance rather than statistical significance. Because once you have the large numbers in your trials, you will achieve the statistical significance anyway.
Right. So now, again, as I remarked a little earlier, it's not to miss the forest for the trees. The key question over here is there a strategy to significantly reduce cardiovascular outcomes? Do we have an answer to that? I believe we have an answer to that. So you can go further deep and find out, differences here and there. But with that, I will stop. Maybe over coffee, you and I can chat more.
Any other questions? Some of the young students sitting behind there, any comments, questions?
They want to know what is for tea. Okay, so maybe before I close, I'm really delighted to have one of our classmates, Gerard Sumant, who's a pediatrician from New York. So he happened to be here
I was about to say he came all the way to listen to this lecture, but I'll tell the truth first. And nice of him, he arrived early this morning from New York and is still awake. So you want to say a few words, Gerard? You can switch that on there.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis and Tony. We have a classmates wanted to be here in such an illustrious company and wonderful work that you've done here. It's really impactful. So proud to be a classmate.
So for the questions, thank you so much, Dr. Dennis, and thank you all for patiently listening and participating. There's tea and coffee served outside in the foyer. Please join us, and you can continue the discussions there offline. Thank you. Thank you, Deepa.
Thank you, Maharaj. இங்க வச்சுட்டு போட்டா இங்க இருப்பீங்களா? நான் போய் டீ குடிச்சு வந்துடுறேன்.
இப்போ அவங்க கொடுத்த கேபினெட் சார்.
If you like to,